Hello and welcome back to CST 2120. So in this lecture, I'm going to explain how you can download data from third-party web services. Things like financial data, sports data, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to start with a short introduction. Then I'm going to explain how you can store the API keys for these third-party web services as environment variables and load them into Node.js. Then I'm going to go through a couple of examples. One is how you can download some financial data, things like stocks, crypto, this kind of stuff. And I'll just show you another example talking about sports data. So it's very common these days for people to make their data available for other people to use through web services. And when that happens, they're usually a commercial company, not necessarily, like the government, UK government made COVID data available through web services during times of COVID. But often, this will be a commercial company like a financial data provider or weather data provider, this kind of stuff. And they make the data available. And one of the great advantages of this is you'll have things like consistent formatting and you have versioning. So they can upgrade their web service without breaking legacy code that's using the old version of the web service. With a good company, you'll have good documentation explaining how the web service works. And most modern web services provide data in JSON format. Older ones maybe used XML in the past. Some provide it in CSV format, like a downloadable spreadsheet. But JSON is pretty much the standard language for providing this kind of data these days. Commercial web services often have like a free tier access. You typically sign up for an API key. They have limited functionality or limited number of calls per day. Excuse me. So here's a few examples. I'm going to go through the financial and the football example later. But, here's some sort of typical ones: financial data, weather data, football data. I'll just show you really. So here's the AlphaVantage one. I like AlphaVantage, that's why I'm using it as an example later. And typical web services, as I said, will be in JSON format, as you can see here. And then you sort of basically tweak the URL and maybe the headers in order to put the API key in there and then get the data that you want back. This is a weather one, currently free. You specify long and latitude and gives you current and previous historical weather. And then there's a couple of football ones that I know, and there's other ones for like basketball and other sports. As I said, the key thing when you're using these is to understand the structure of the URL. That's typically very important. They'll have and this is all covered in the documentation of the web service. And then you also have to spend some time understanding how the JSON is structured so you can extract the data that you need. Now, to access these web services, there's typically 3 connection methods, maybe more. Most standard one is HTTP. There's also often Node.js module that sort of will download the data from the web service for you. In a lot of cases, this is just basically a sort of thin wrapper for the HTTP client, so you don't really need to bother with it. But in other cases, I'll explain, using the Node.js module can be quite useful. And WebSockets, I'm not covering in this module, are a sort of bi-directional method of communication over HTTP, kind of, They're very useful in certain circumstances, and if you want like a live data feed in which you kind of push the new data to all the listening clients, then WebSockets is great, but I'm not going to cover that here. I'm just going to focus on HTTP, which is kind of covered in this module. So if we're going to use HTTP to download the data, we need an HTTP client. And we're going to be writing this code. This is code, right? We want to write some code on Node.js to download the data. So we need an HTTP client that will run on Node, And the one I like is Axios. There's a few of these things out there, but it's promise-based, really easy to use. I've had no issues with it at all. So I personally recommend Axios, but if you want to use a different one, that's fine, But you do need an HTTP client on Node.js that will work with JavaScript, So here's a little simple example with Axios. So, you install the Axios module using npm. You should be very familiar with that by now. Now, this is the crucial thing with any kind of web service. We need to get the URL right. Now, obviously, here I'm just showing you how to ping the Middlesex site and get all the HTML. But if we're working with a more complex example, we'd have to construct quite a complicated URL with the appropriate query parameters and path to get the exact data we need. And I'll cover that when it comes to AlphaVantage. Then Axios is easier than fetch. We just have a single call where we do axios.get or post or whatever we want to do. And then we promise base, so we do await and it gets the response. And response data will have all of the data, all of the body from the web service. So just show you a little example. Here we've got Axios, just a little example. So we're importing Axios, building the URL structure, pinging it, and here I'm just outputting the data because it's not very sort of exciting data. But later we'll talk about processing the data in a more kind of complex way. So let's just do node Axios. And so pinged here Axios has pinged the homepage of Middlesex, and it's a HTML site, right? So it's not a web service. So here we can see all the HTML from the Middlesex homepage. Yeah? So that's what the data is and how to download it. And this is sort of a little bit about how to use it. Yeah. So I have seen in the past people writing code on the front end that pings the web service and then puts the data straight into the page. Yeah. But you should definitely not do that in this module. Yeah. And in general, that's probably a terrible idea. Yeah. What you should do is download the third-party data and put it in MongoDB, create a new collection for the data. Yeah. Then put a new path on your web service, where clients can access the data, and you can call that what you like. This is all part of the advanced functionality, so you can create your own paths for that advanced functionality. But please don't directly download it from the front end, right? If you've got API keys, you'd have to put them in the front end code to download it from there. And obviously then anyone who has your website effectively has your API keys and can use those to download the data directly themselves, and that will hammer your, the number of calls you can make per day. Yeah. So never do that, okay? And don't download it server-side in response to client request either. I've often seen people, they've got a front end, it pings a web service, the web service then calls the third-party API, gets the data, and then sends it back to the client, okay? So one problem with that is it's going to be very slow, right? Because not only do you have to wait for the communication between client and server, you've got to wait for a second set of communications between the server and the API, and then everything to be returned, yeah? More importantly, if you're paying for your third-party web service, or you're on a free plan, you'll almost certainly have a limited number of calls you can make per day, right? Because the third-party company doesn't want to get endlessly hammered, for requests that you're not paying for. Yeah. So if every time a client requests the data, it calls the third-party web service, that's going to use up your calls a lot as you get more and more clients. Yeah. So much better to kind of cache the data locally in your database and then provide it on demand to your clients. Yeah, and obviously under some conditions that may or may not be permissible under the terms and conditions of the third-party web service. So you should obviously check that if this was a commercial product. Yeah. So in order to make use of these third-party web services, we often have authentication. Yeah, because they want to, they're providing a service. Service costs them money to provide. And so often they'll want to check, you'll need to have an account with them in order to be able to use their service. Yeah. Now, some web services, like I said, UK government ones, for example, won't have authentication on them. So you can just ping the URL and you'll get back the data. Probably block you if you hammer them. But with a lot of these kind of commercial web services, you have an API key of some kind. Yeah. Sometimes this is really simple. We just put this in the query as a query string parameter. Sometimes it'll go as an HTTP in the HTTP header, and I'll show you an example of both of those. Yeah. And then with sort of real fancy web services, we might have OAuth or something like that. Yeah. And this is a more complicated combination of access key and secret access key. There's like an authentication server. I've never actually, got my head around how all this works in the detail, because often when there's an OAuth authentication, someone will have written a Node.js library to kind of handle all that complexity, right? So back in the day, I used to use Twitter, for example, to kind of pull tweets and all this kind of stuff. You can use Node.js or Java or whatever. And they had OAuth authentication, and then you had to kind of, and it was just easier using the Node.js module to handle that, yeah? But here I'm going to keep it simple, just focus on query string parameters and header parameters, yeah? Now, when we're dealing with API keys, we need to be a bit careful, right? Because, yes, we could just dump them inside our code, but then if we're using GitHub or something, we might end up checking them into a, GitHub repository where anyone could access them. You need to take care of your API keys, because anyone who has those API keys can do whatever you can do with a third-party web service and potentially use up your number of calls per day or whatever kind of thing, yeah? You really don't want to mess around, losing these keys or making them public and that, yeah? So if you put them in code, like I said, you can end up checking them in. You might end up handing them to me. Not that I'm going to do anything with them, but, stuff happens here. I might lose it or something. Who knows, yeah? And obviously, if you're using them in code, you might have them in several places, and then you've got to change them in several places and all that. So all in all, it's much, much better to put your API keys in as environment variables. Environment variables are basically variables that are in the kind of workspace, if you like, of the executing program, yeah? And this, you have environment variables for lots of stuff like the path, JDK, the user, whatever kind of thing, yeah? And you can echo, by just doing, you can do echo, I mean, this is a slightly complicated way of doing it, but you can echo the environment variables in PowerShell, for example, on a Mac, so you can see all the ones that have been set, yeah? And you can see, you know, it's like path and program data and all this kind of stuff, yeah? You can set these environment variables in lots of ways, right? So there's system tools like the window control panel. You can like set the environment variables there for all users or the current user. There's a way of doing it on the command line. You can just set them on the shell, for example. And some IDEs will let you set them. If you're in a cloud environment, there's a way of setting environment variables. Here I'm going to talk about the .env Node.js module, which does a similar thing, just using a bit of code, yeah? So what we do in Node.js, and this is what I would recommend you do, is we create a file called .env. Now, in terms of GitHub, you can control it, so you can not commit, you know, files that start with a dot to the repository, and that kind of protects you from making your keys public. Yeah. Now we put our environment variables inside the .env file, and then there's a Node.js library that will copy the variables from this file into the environment variables. Yeah. So that then you can access them in JavaScript using process.env or whatever it's called, yeah? So then you can keep them in a safe place. You can prevent those environment variables, those API keys from being sent into the GitHub repository, and please don't submit them when you submit your final code, yeah? Here's little examples. Here's my .env file. Here you've got it's like you don't need quotation marks or anything, you just have the key here. This is called demo API key, and then equals, and then whatever the API key happens to be, in this case, my demo API key. So it's pretty easy to use. And then to use that with .env, we just import the module after installing it with npm. We just call .env config, and that basically loads them into environment variables. And then we can access them in our code using process.env and then the name of the key, yeah? And so here I'm just logging it out. And obviously what I'm logging out here is the demo API key that's stored in the env file, yeah? If you forget to do .env config, this will not work, so you must do .env config, yeah? So I've talked about kinds of services that are out there, and there's a lot of different third-party web services. Basically, any kind of data you want, almost certainly there's be something out there for it, unless it's really a little bit too niche, yeah? And now I just want to show you with a couple of examples how to get that data and process it. Obviously, you're going to have to read the documentation of whatever web service you're using, and I'll talk you through that as well, yeah? So let's start with financial data example. I'm going to use AlphaVantage. I used to teach a third year module where they kind of downloaded data from different web services for their projects, and a lot of students gravitated towards AlphaVantage for the financial data because it's got a lot of stuff, right? It's got Forex, you know, like exchange rates of currency. It's got stock prices. You've got all the crypto stuff on there. You've got commodities like, you know, oil and gas and all this kind of stuff. And it's even got sentiment data for finance, right? So text data about the different financial products, and as well as sentiment analysis of that, saying whether people are saying good or bad things about these financial products, yeah? So there's URL, alphavantage.co. And with any of these web services, you must read the documentation, or you will not have a clue how to actually use them, yeah? AlphaVantage has an API key, which you don't need a credit card or anything, you just sign up for it and it's given to you. And you put this API key in the query parameters, yeah? And I'll show you how to do that. I think you only get like 25 calls per day on the free tier with this, but that's plenty because they have some really good historical data endpoints where you can grab, you know, the last 5 years worth of Bitcoin or something like that, yeah? So, in order to use any of these third-party web services, you need to do these steps, yeah? You need to read the documentation, sign up for an API key if necessary. Then before you actually write any code, you should test the API using an HTTP client or a browser. Yeah? I'll typically use a browser when it's just a URL, when the API key is in the as a URL query parameter. Otherwise, I'll use something like ThunderClient or Postman or something similar if I have to put the API key in the header. And I'll show you both examples here. Yeah. And then we write the code, right? So once we tested it, we've looked at the structure of the data coming back, we've got the URL right, that's the time to start writing the code, yeah? So first thing I would do is read the documentation. These typically will have like examples of URLs, which you can then modify to get the exact data you want. Then you want to test it, right? Once you've figured out what the structure looks like, you can whack it into a browser, whack it into an HTTP client, and then you'll see or the data coming back and how it's structured, yeah? Because you can't write code that extracts the data until you understand the structure of that data, yeah? Now here, just a sort of general tip, I'm using an extension for Chrome. Can't remember what it's called JSON parse or something that just lays out the JSON pretty, so it's much easier to sort of see what's going on rather than this sort of enormous blob of text, yeah? So now we've understand this, we've got our API key, we're ready to write code, yeah? So this stuff I've covered already. I've explained how to use .env, how to import Axios. I'm not going to cover that here. This is the bit that depends on you having read the documentation, right? Because the URL for AlphaVantage is, you know, carefully structured so that you can ping it to get the different parts of data, right? They've got these different functions like digital currency daily. Then you've got this is digital currency. So here it's an exchange rate between one digital currency and a sort of normal currency. In this case, it's BTC, Bitcoin, and the market. And obviously, if you get these symbols wrong, you're just going to get junk here. And then we've got the API key, which here I'm loading from process.env, as I explained earlier, yeah? So we need to build this complex URL string. And what I would typically do if the code breaks or I can't get it to work, I'd log out the URL string and then put it back in the browser or an HTTP client to make sure that that works, yeah? Because often you're going to get errors like you're missing an ampersand or, you know, missing an equals or something, and that will cause you problems when you're trying to download the data, yeah? So get the URL right. Get the URL right for the data you want, and that's looking at documentation. Then you download it, and I've explained how to do that, pretty easy, yeah? And then response.data will have what you need, yeah? And then we can log it out and pick out the bits of data that we want from that complicated JSON document that's returned, yeah? And to pick out the data, in case of AlphaVantage, if you looked at the structure of the JSON object, it's got this time series digital currency daily. I'm just working through, and each of the keys in this array are dates, right? So I'm just working through all the keys in this array using in, and then I'm fishing out the opening price of each of these digital currencies, yeah? Of the digital currency at each of these dates, yeah? So again, you've got to look at the structure here. We've got a bunch of metadata we don't care about. As I said here, this is an array here. No, it's not an array, sorry, it's an object. That's why I'm using in here, forgot about that. Yeah, so we're using date in because it's an object. So this is JavaScript object, right, with a bunch of keys, and each of these keys is a date. And inside these keys, inside each of these objects here, we've got open, high, low, close, etc. So I need to pick out this object, work through the keys in this object, and then I'm just, for an example, picking out the opening price here, yeah? So that's what this code is doing here, yeah? So you have to understand the JSON object and how to pick out stuff from arrays and objects and all that in JavaScript object, and then we can get out the right data, yeah? So it's pretty straightforward once you've kind of got those basic things, yeah? So here's my code, right? Same code I just showed you, right? So let's quickly run it. Axios football AlphaVantage, yeah? So run the code, and then here, as I said, it's an object here, time series. I'm working through each of the keys in that object, and I'm logging out the date, which is the date here, the exchange rate, which is the open price here. Wait a minute, sorry, yeah, the time. So I'm working through this object. The date I already got there, and the exchange rate is just the open price here. And so I'm just picking out that particular key value pair kind of thing with open as the key kind of thing. And then that's giving me the exchange rate here, yeah? So pretty straightforward, yeah? But you can't do this without understanding the structure of the JSON document, yeah? So just sort of throw in another example just to show you different authentication method, different structure, but it's the same basic procedure with most of these third-party web services, yeah? So here I'm using football data, mainly because I'm familiar with it. There's another API for football that's quite good, but I'm just picking this kind of randomly, really. It's decent. And it's got a free plan with certain leagues and seasons and this kind of stuff. I have to say I find it a bit fiddly because it's one of these APIs where you have to make one call to get a list of IDs and teams or something. Once you've got the team ID, you can then ping it in, put it in to get the details of the team or get the details of the competition and so on, yeah? So getting the right IDs for leagues, competitions, all this kind of stuff requires a little bit of thought and a little bit of reading documentation. I mean, it's not super difficult, but it will take just a bit of focus, yeah, to get it done, yeah? The API key, again, you get a free one in the basic plan, yeah. And instead of doing it as a query parameter, we're going to have to put it in the header, and the key for the header is this XAuth token, yeah. And I'll just show you how that works in a sec, yeah. So there's the home page, yeah. It's pretty straightforward. There's documentation. There's this free plan with 12 competitions, scores delayed, fixtures, schedules delayed, this kind of stuff, yeah. There may be other ones out there that have better data for free, but I'm really just using this as an example, yeah? Now, because we've got I can't just chuck the URL in the browser this time, because I have to put something in the header in that GET request that's being sent to the football data, yeah? So now I have to use an HTTP client, currently like Thunder client, and so what I'm doing is I'm clicking on headers, and I'm adding my own header here, XORth token. And obviously I've blurred it out because I can't be bothered to change my key, after, so I don't want you guys to have it in this lecture, yeah? So ping it, put XORth token in the header, and if it shows me, I should have put it in there, but here you can see what's coming back, yeah? So in the URL here, I know, I told you these things have versions. I'm looking for the team with ID 86, and I'm trying to get the details of that team, yeah? That's what this URL is doing, and then this is the authentication for that, yeah? So it kind of works the same as AlphaVantage. It's not complicated, really. We've got the standard stuff with Axios and .env. Then we're building the URL. As I explained, this URL, you need to look at the documentation. But in this case, the team ID will give you the details about that team, yeah? And then you have to go elsewhere on the paths to find, for example, the upcoming fixtures and all that, yeah? So here, similar thing, we're doing axios.get with the URL, but here I have to add in the headers information, because I have to put XORth token, I have to put my API key in there, yeah? So just respect where this API key needs to go. In football data, in terms of football data, it has to go in the header. It can't go as a query parameter, yeah? And then same as Axios, we just need to look at the structure of the data. Okay, so in this case, we've got an array called squad, and in the array, each of the objects has keys. For example, if I wanted the name and position, those are a couple of keys in each of the objects in that array, yeah? So all I have to do is work through, in this case, because I'm working through objects in array, response data squad, and then I can output the player name and the player position, yeah? So just show you the working as a little illustration. Let's just run that, yeah. Okay, and you can see here it's worked rather nicely. We've got out, the different names and the positions, yeah, rather like goalkeepers, but, don't know much about football, so maybe that makes sense, yeah? That's about it, right? I've just sort of tried to introduce you to the idea of downloading data from third-party web services. Obviously in the labs, talk to us, and if you want to get data from a third-party web service that we haven't covered here, of which there are many, then we can help you, figure out how to do it. Yeah, but I think you've got enough. You can see that the code is like 10 lines max, so it's really not that complicated to write. Yeah. There's lots of them out there, lots of different types of data, there's police data out there, there's health data out there, there's all kinds of stuff, yeah? Most of the kind of commercial ones will have a free plan with some restrictions, and, usually use something like Axios standard HTTP client to download the data, or there'll also be Node modules, and if Node modules are a thin wrapper for the HTTP client, I wouldn't bother with it. If it's doing something more for you, like OAuth authentication, then probably worth using, yeah? You have to read the web service documentation, otherwise you will not understand how to do this. And I strongly recommend you try out the web service with a couple of URLs and maybe the appropriate authentication in something like Thunder Client or in the browser, so you can see the structure of the data and make sure it's working, and then you can write the code that will download that data. Yeah? Please remember, your data must be downloaded server-side and must be stored in MongoDB before being made available to the client. As I said, it's a student project, so don't worry too much about terms and conditions. If this is a commercial project, we might have to sort of rethink that if it wasn't a free service, yeah? And then once you've got the data in MongoDB, then you can expose it to your clients using a new path on your web service. Yeah, there's no rules about what that path should look like, except that it must start with your student ID, yeah? So don't directly download it from the front end, because that's going to expose your API keys if there are any. And don't download it server-side in response to a client request. As I said, if the client requests the data and then the server goes off and gets the data and returns it to the client, there'll be a long delay, and it's going to use up your free calls to the third-party web service. Yeah, so if you've only got 25 free calls from AlphaVantage and the clients, and you're doing it this way, then you're going to use them up when 25 people have looked at your website in one day. Yeah, which doesn't make any sense at all. Yeah. So just download it server-side, put it in MongoDB, expose it with a path, as long as that path starts with your student ID, you can call it whatever you like, yeah? And that's it.